Hey everyone! If you enjoyed this video, the full version is available on Patreon. I'll be uploading all my content there going forward.
Chapter 1. Where am I? Mr. Thorne, you're finally awake. Thorne's gaze sharpened. The hairy head was covered with countless compound eyes, which gleamed coldly under the lamplight. He would never mistake it. Moths? Weren't you all dead? The other person was clearly taken aback for a moment, and then a very human-like look of confusion appeared on that hairy face. The situation is quite serious. Miss Moth muttered something under her breath while quickly jotting down notes in her notebook, hallucinations accompanied by speech impairment. I roughly understand. The red ant, wearing a white lab coat, closed its notebook and nodded slightly. It was a large ant with distinct segments and a shiny carapace. For some reason, just standing there gave people a feeling of extraordinary strength and reliability. So, in your opinion, everyone is an insect, is that right? Thorne took a deep breath and nodded. The moth remained standing to one side, its wings fluttering slightly. Thorne wasn't sure if it was just his imagination, but he felt as if it were smiling. Yes. He looked at the doctor, his tone slightly hesitant. For example, to me, you're just an ant. Oh. The red ant chuckled softly, its two mandibles opening and closing gently. That's really unexpected. I thought I'd at least be a rhinoceros beetle or something. The moth beside them couldn't help but chuckle softly. The two insects exchanged a glance, revealing a tacit understanding. As for what you just mentioned, the insect kingdom, the palace full of chainsaws, and the claim that you were originally Huxia. Red Ant said calmly, it can basically be determined to be either a remnant of a dream or a delusion. However, the situation isn't the worst yet. He paused, then continued, although you might see others as insects, you don't consider yourself an insect, which means your self-awareness is still relatively intact. As he spoke, he handed a document to Thorne. Thorne looked down. Diagnosis: schizophrenia with delusional disorder. Treatment recommendations are as follows. These words themselves didn't bother him too much. What truly made his heart sink was the small print at the very bottom of the document. July 31, 1991. So. Thorne murmured, isn't this my original world? Upon hearing this, the moth and the red ant exchanged a glance, clearly interpreting his reaction as despair at reality. The red ant cleared its throat, its tone softening. Although it will have some impact on your life, we have already conducted a comprehensive examination for you. Your condition is not a pathological injury. As long as you take your medication on time, relax, and face life positively, there is a high probability of recovery. He seemed to remember something, and added. There was another patient who insisted that magic exists in this world, and that there are horses with wings and bird heads. Thorne looked up, and then. He later recovered very well and returned to a normal life. Oh. Thorne was taken aback. How did he do that? The red ant stroked its chin and pondered for a while. He once rammed his head so hard against that pillar between platforms 9 and 10 at a London train station that he bled profusely. Since then, I haven't had a relapse. Thorne's lips twitched violently. Is this considered a doctor's order? As Thorne walked out of the hospital and onto the bustling streets, he still felt a strong sense of unreality. This is Britain in the 1990s. The streets were already filled with cars. Steel and exhaust fumes formed a familiar scene of human society. The only problem is that those cars aren't driven by humans. Mosquitoes, grasshoppers, mantises. Insects of various shapes and sizes skillfully maneuvered the steering wheel, weaving through the traffic, their compound eyes reflecting the light of the streetlights. Thorne instinctively clenched his fist. He tried to mobilize his forces and summon back the vital allies who had once roamed the insect kingdom and fought alongside him on the battlefield. However, he was met only with empty silence. There was no feedback, no resonance. Reality coldly told him that it was all true. His power has completely vanished. Following the information provided by the hospital, Thorne took the subway to the body's original home. The subway cars were clean, bright, and had a modern feel. All around, whether standing or sitting, were insects. On their faces, however, clear and complex human expressions kept appearing. Exhausted, numb, anxious, expectant. That sense of incongruity is hard to accept. A tremendous sense of absurdity weighed on Thorne's mind. He forced himself to stop looking at the insects and instead turned his gaze to the rapidly receding tunnel outside the window, beginning to sort through the memories in his mind. The original owner of this body was named Eric Thorne. Orphan. A long history of mental illness. After this medical visit, I was almost penniless. Wow, what a start! Thorne couldn't help but give a wry smile. Although it's much better than the last time I woke up directly in the abyss, my current situation has almost completely cut off any possibility of making a living. He looked down at his reflection in the car window. It was a gloomy and haggard young face. His face was pale, his eyes were slightly sunken, and his gaze was constantly wandering. Her messy hair clung to her forehead, and she exuded a sense of dejection from chronic sleep deprivation. The dire economic situation, coupled with his already severe mental illness. The original owner was completely pushed into the abyss of despair. Even just recalling that memory, Thorne could clearly feel the loneliness that almost devoured him. Therefore, the original owner gave up on survival. He neither ate nor drank, wandered aimlessly, and eventually collapsed on the street. That's how the scene of waking up in the hospital came about. The subway has arrived. Thorne stepped off the platform and walked through the dense swarm of insects. He suddenly realized that his illness might not be so simple. It's not just about appearance. Even the conversations of the humans around me had, without my noticing, turned into the shrill and unfamiliar chirping of insects. Squeak. 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 Buzz. 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 Ah. 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 The sounds were chaotic and shrill, as if they were coming from all directions. The feeling of being excluded by the whole world caused Thorne's frustration to surge again. His reason told him that these were all human beings. But he couldn't understand their language, couldn't see their faces, and even their form of existence was incompatible with his. It's unbearable. Especially the sound of those mosquitoes. This is so agonizing. What difference is there between this and staying in Hall Honest? What was the point of paying such a terrible price and risking everything to leave that place? Or perhaps, just like the doctor said, the insect kingdom, is it really just a dream? Is the identity of a time traveler also a delusion? The more Thorne thought about it, the more irritable he became. When he stood in front of his rented house, listening to the incessant chirping of insects all around him, he finally couldn't take it anymore. He needs to vent. Under the astonished gazes of those around him, Thorne suddenly raised his arms, his voice hoarse and desperate. Are there still humans left here? But, unexpectedly, clusters of pure white energy, with distorted outlines that seemed to be screaming, surged wildly from his body. What? My vision was suddenly engulfed by white light. The next moment, Thorne lost consciousness. I don't know how much time has passed. The familiar white ceiling came into view. Thorne slowly opened his eyes, his vision still a little blurry. You're back again. He was momentarily at a loss for words, unsure whether to laugh or cry. I never expected to end up in the hospital again so soon. Should I apologize to that red ant doctor? Besides, what exactly happened? The image of that white substance surging from my body flashed through my mind. Could it be that I can still use soul magic? As Thorne pondered, he forced himself to sit up against the headboard. Just then, a voice rang out. You're awake, Mr. Thorne. Thorne looked up. 2 humans were standing in front of the bed. Oh no, to be precise, they were 2 insects. It was a snail, its brown, spiraling shell gleaming coldly, its gaze somber. The other was a bee, with a smiling face, looking quite old, yet possessing an exceptionally gentle demeanor. He seemed to still be unwrapping a candy in his hand. Well. Thorne cleared his throat. Excuse me, gentlemen, I'm not entirely clear on the situation. May I ask, what happened? The snail snorted coldly, clearly lacking patience. Eric Thorne, you don't remember, do you? He picked up a notebook with his seemingly slippery tentacle, his tone cold and formulaic. Use mass destruction magic within Muggle public areas. This resulted in 1 Muggle being seriously injured, 3 others slightly injured, and 1 building collapsing. This also violates the Secret Service Act, the Prohibition of Misuse of Dark Magic Act, and the Muggle Protection Act, which is currently being drafted. The case has been appealed to Wisconsin Germain. The snail closed its notebook, its gaze chilling. I think it'll just be a life sentence in Azkaban. He paused for a moment. So, is there anything else you want to explain? Forehead. After listening to this long string of words, Thorne rubbed his temples, looking troubled. Well, I don't even know where to begin. The words that came out of the other person's mouth were increasingly unfamiliar. Muggle? Azkaban? He had never even heard of it. After a moment of silence, Thorne cautiously spoke. Before you start making excuses, may I ask one question? Where exactly is this place? The snail was clearly extremely unhappy with his attempt to change the subject. You mean, you don't know? Delixie. Just then, another voice interrupted him. The older bee spoke slowly, his tone gentle and composed. I think it would be possible for me to speak with Mr. Thorne alone. After all, judging from his background, he was indeed just a Muggle with a history of mental illness in his early life. There's no need to interrogate him like a dark wizard. The snail frowned, seemingly dissatisfied with the suggestion, but still shook its head. I dare say that's just a waste of time, Dumbledore. The moment the name was uttered, Thorne's brow suddenly twitched. Hiss. Why does that sound so familiar? The bee ignored the snail's mutterings and simply turned its gaze back to Thorne. Those deep, compound eyes held a mixture of scrutiny and interest. Mr. Thorne, he said calmly, this is the St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Injuries. The largest medical institution in the magical world. Thorne was stunned. His mind went blank, and the bewilderment on his face was undisguised. Because at this very moment, a familiar notification tone suddenly rang in his ear. Ding! Special environment detected, exploration system activated. Current special environment, St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Damage. Exploration progress, 0.3%. Chapter 2. Ding! The exploration function will be triggered when the host enters a special location with a long history. This feature will reward the user based on their exploration progress in this location. Exploration progress reaches 30%, reward, soul container fragment times 1. Exploration progress reached 60%, reward, spell shard x1. Exploration complete at 100%, reward, warrior's dream. Soul container fragment, collect 2 fragments to increase soul capacity by 1. Spell shard, collect 4 shards to enhance a single spell. Warrior's dream, the ghost of a powerful warrior still lingers in the world, its specific benefits cannot be predicted until it is truly obtained. This description is all too familiar. If an ordinary person were to unexpectedly travel to the abyss of hollowness without any preparation or external assistance, it would essentially be tantamount to a death sentence. That place is the location of the void, which even the pale King Worm had to seal himself. Thorne is still able to sit here peacefully, and can even talk to the old bee. Ultimately, it's all thanks to this exploration system in front of us. Almost instinctively, Thorne brought up the system panel. Name, Thorne Eric. Race, human/bound container. Weapon, none. Mask, bound. Amulet, bound. Spell library, 3 white spells, Howling Spectre, Vengeful Spirit, Desolate Dive. Soul capacity, 1/1. Item, none. Properties, none. Number of special scenes activated, 23. Current special scenario, St. Mungo's Hospital, 0.3%. The screen was filled with nothing and a uniform already bound. Thorne was at peace with himself. Alas, the various relationships in this body were so terrible that they gave him a strange sense of acceptance. Mr. Thorne, what's wrong? The sound of the old bee pulled Thorne back from his thoughts. No, it's nothing. Thorne paused for a moment, then quickly composed himself, managing to put on a normal expression. This is a good thing, he said to himself. At least I have a system with me. No matter what, it's much better than going back to the situation where I could be evicted by the landlord at any time, right? Thinking of this, Thorne let out a long breath. When he looked up at the old bee again, a faint smile was on his face, and his entire demeanor was completely different from before. Could I tell you more information? Thorne's tone calmed down. For example, the Ministry of Magic, or yourself. The old bee's dozens of compound eyes narrowed slightly at that moment, as if squinting, scrutinizing Thorne's sudden change in attitude. After a moment, he gave a meaningful smile. Sure. As the other person spoke at a leisurely pace, fragmented but familiar terms gradually pieced together a complete picture. Thorne murmured the name in his heart. Dumbledore. At this point, he was almost certain. It seems I've entered another work of art once again. Harry Potter. Those were his once wildly popular literary works. To be honest, it's really not his fault that he didn't react immediately. What are Wizengamer and Azkaban, if you take these words out of context, who can immediately associate them with Hogwarts? If the other party had mentioned Hogwarts from the beginning, things would have been much simpler. Moreover, this world setting was almost entirely unfamiliar to him. He has only seen one movie at most. The only lasting impression I had was of this movie, it was truly dark. Even Dumbledore was someone I'd only vaguely heard of, not someone I knew well, and apparently he even fell from a building and died. Wow, a wizard can die from a fall, so his strength must be pretty average. Okay, that's roughly the situation. After introducing the Ministry of Magic and some basic common knowledge, the old bee stopped talking and looked at Thorne with a smile. So, Mr. Thorne, is there anything else you would like to know? Before anyone knew it, a cup of black tea had appeared in his hand. Thorne glanced at the other person out of the corner of his eye and happened to see them drop 6 sugar cubes into the cup. Hiss! Thorne instinctively gasped. This isn't just a matter of it being too sweet, this is practically a lethal dose. As expected of a bee. He decisively looked away to avoid affecting his judgment, and after thinking for a moment, he spoke. There is indeed another problem. The one Mr. Dellis mentioned earlier, Azkaban. Thorne tried to keep his tone calm. What place is that? Is it also a magic school? Cough cough. Dumbledore choked on his tea on the spot. He gave Thorne a rather strange look, then shook his head. No, Azkaban is not a school. That was a prison specifically for witches. Oh, prison. Is there a difference? Dumbledore seemed ready to leave immediately, but he maintained a calm tone, without a hint of joking. Mr. Thorne, given your current situation, there is indeed a possibility that you could be sent there. Thorne's eyes narrowed slightly. No. If he cannot freely explore the world, his exploration system is essentially useless. In that case, he would lose even his last resort. So you absolutely must not go with that snail. The snail is right outside the door. His soul capacity was only enough to cast one spell. The solution is then clear, use a spell to take one out first. The remaining one will be dealt with using physical techniques. Thorne was rapidly calculating in his mind. Then, he straightened up slightly and began to activate the soul magic within his body. But Dumbledore suddenly coughed, as if he couldn't help it. Cough cough. My old bones can't withstand that blow. Thorne looked up and his eyes met Dumbledore's briefly. The next second, Thorne suddenly relaxed his body and lay back down on the hospital bed. Oh, I'm sorry. Dumbledore looked at him, his smile still gentle. Fine. Just don't try to blow me up, Mr. Thorne. Your magic is truly special. Thorne's heart sank. They saw right through me. Since the other party had already noticed his preparations and could still calmly offer a reminder, it meant that this old bee was definitely not as simple as he appeared on the surface. They must have more than just a few skills. Thorne completely gave up any intention of resisting. Never mind. Go to jail and behave yourself. We'll figure out a way to escape later. Should I get a map of the prison tattooed on my body first? Just as Thorne was completely lying down, Dumbledore watched him with great interest, his compound eyes flashing with obvious excitement. Very interesting. I've never seen this type of magic before. So pure, and so stable. He paused, his tone becoming increasingly serious. More importantly, when they dug you out of the rubble, they found a white light emanating from your body, actively repairing it. Dumbledore leaned forward slightly, as if he had seen extremely valuable experimental material. I think it must be a completely new system of magic. It's well worth studying. He smiled and uttered the final sentence. So, do you want to be a teacher? Upon hearing this, Thorne couldn't help but rub his temples. Excuse me, Principal. Let's not even talk about the fact that I'm going to jail. His tone became more serious. I must explain something first. The reason I was able to do those things is because I'm not human either. Dumbledore's expression visibly froze, a hint of confusion appearing in his compound eyes. Also. That's not important. Thorne waved his hand, feeling that he was indeed closer to a human than a bee. In short, this is merely an ability bestowed upon me by my unique physical constitution, it's not knowledge that can be taught. That being said. But Dumbledore's "I'm very interested in you" expression didn't fade at all. It's even becoming more and more obvious. Thorne felt a chill run down his spine and instinctively shuddered. What is this old man trying to do? That's enough. The door to the ward was suddenly pushed open. Dumbledore, this kid can't be taken away by you. Delilah walked in with a cold face, his gaze sweeping over Thorne like a knife. Kid, you're going to prison. Whether you know these laws or not, you killed someone, and you can't escape that. Deli, loud noises are prohibited in the hospital. Just then, another figure entered the ward. The moment Thorne saw the other person, a scene inexplicably flashed into his mind. In the City of Tears, there are those aristocratic insects, their bodies dripping with oil and their clothes splendid. This is a fat, golden cockroach. Its entire carapace gleamed, and its 2 tentacles were even trimmed into elegant curves, exuding an undisguised aura of power. There should be a lot of money after killing him, right? Minister. Deli's expression changed. What brings you here? Fudge. Dumbledore said calmly, long time no see. Ah, yes, Dumbledore. The golden cockroach scoffed, every time I see you, nothing good ever comes of it. But I've solved a bad problem for you this time, haven't I? All the muggles aren't going to pursue it, which saves a lot of trouble. Furthermore, Mr. Thorne has always been a muggle and has not demonstrated any magical talent, so he has not violated the Secret Act. As you know, Hogwarts is in charge of discovering wizards, so leaving it to the school is the safest option. By the way, where's what I asked for? After a moment of silence, Fudge pulled a paper bag from his pocket and tossed it to Dumbledore. He walked into the ward, his gaze sweeping over the group before finally settling on Thorne, who was still sitting on the bed, looking completely bewildered. All right, you'll get what you want eventually. He waved his tentacles impatiently. You can take him now. Delisi immediately stepped forward, his tone surprised. Minister, this is a murderer. How can we allow a murderer to teach at a school? I won't let him go. You will. Fudge said calmly. And now, he's no longer a murderer. Thorne was stunned by these words. Delixi was also stunned. Dumbledore took a candy from the paper bag, put it in his mouth, and smiled slightly, as if he had expected this scene. A friend of mine sent me some small gifts. Perfect timing, it comes in handy now. If it's just a near-death experience, it can still be saved. As he spoke, he handed the paper bag to Thorne, stood up, and straightened his sleeves. He then turned to Thorne, who was still not fully recovered, and spoke in a gentle and natural tone. All right. Professor Thorne. Please come with me. We're going to Hogwarts. Wait a minute, Headmaster. I have another request, Thorne suddenly said. As you know, I'm a mental patient, so going back to the hospital is like going home for me. So, may I have a tour of my house? Chapter 3. Inside the St. Mungo's Hospital, where magical damage occurred. In the reception room, Thorne sat on a bench, flipping through a Hogwarts brochure, his gaze wandering aimlessly around the room. Insects were everywhere. The insects, in various shapes and strange states, were communicating their illnesses through a cacophony of chirping sounds. Mosquitoes with only 4 legs, bullnose bugs with mantis-like forearms, tiny insects that tremble incessantly, and countless others missing limbs. But perhaps precisely because they were all insects, Thorne didn't find the sights particularly strange. On the contrary, the chaotic, noisy atmosphere, yet imbued with a certain familiar order, gave him a strange sense of disorientation. It felt like stepping back into the human world, into an overcrowded county hospital. However, the people here are all insects. Just then, the door to the reception room was pushed open. A bee's head poked its head in. Thorne. Dumbledore smiled and said, if your tour is over, we can depart. The Portkaya application has been approved. Thorne immediately closed the booklet, stood up, and followed the old bee out of the reception room. The two people, or rather, the person and the insect, walked down the corridor toward a narrow little room. There seemed to be a fly sitting in the room, dressed in a therapist's uniform. To be honest, its round, plump shape gave Thorne an extremely strong sense of incongruity. However, he wasn't in the mood to look any further, and only spoke hesitantly. Professor, I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne. Dumbledore interrupted him calmly, his tone still gentle. Unless I want to lose a cash cow. He paused, as if realizing his wording was inappropriate. No, he's an excellent professor. Otherwise, I absolutely will not allow you to continue visiting this intensive care unit. Thorne paused for a moment, then couldn't help but ask in return. But the problem is, Mr. Principal. Does this place mean that 70% of the area is an intensive care unit? As he said this, his gaze was already fixed on his system panel. Current special environment, St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Damage, 31.3%. Rewards obtained, Soul Container Fragment X1. Dumbledore turned around, glanced at Thorne, and smiled slightly. Mr. Thorne. We are wizards. You'll get used to it eventually. After saying that, he signed his name in the booklet that the therapist, Fly, handed him. A wizard. Thorne silently closed the system panel. He suddenly had a strong premonition that his future as a teacher in this world was probably not so rosy. Under the supervision of Ministry of Magic staff, Thorne just had a brief tour of the 1st, 5th, and 6th floors of St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Arts. As for the middle floors, it was said to be too dangerous, which was the critical area Dumbledore referred to, and he was not allowed to approach it. Just looking at the names of those departments is enough to kill any curiosity. Departments of Biological Damage, Department of Odd Diseases and Infections, and Department of Medicinal and Plant Poisoning. It certainly doesn't seem like a place a Muggle should casually set foot in. That does indeed align with Dumbledore's statement. However, Thorne still felt a strange sense of curiosity. The main reason is, back in Hollownest, he had seen insects infected with all sorts of strange things before. Yeah, the kind where you're not exactly clean, both physically and in your dreams. I'd really like to compare them. Of course, this idea only briefly crossed my mind. Next, he saw Dumbledore pick something up from the side. It was a rather old-looking toilet plunger. This is the door key. The old bee spoke as casually as if introducing a teacup. It will take us where we're meant to be, just hold on. As he spoke, he had already grasped one end of the plunger. Wait a minute. Dumbledore seemed to suddenly remember something and looked at Thorne. Mr. Thorne, I noticed you were looking at a Hogwarts brochure just now. My previous introduction was indeed rather general. That document gave you a more comprehensive understanding. What are your thoughts? Thorne looked completely bewildered, but he still obediently grabbed the handle. How should I put it? He thought for a moment and then said truthfully. Actually, I didn't finish it, I only read the Slytherin part. I personally disagree with their policy of only accepting students with wizarding backgrounds. Strictly speaking, this is also a form of racial discrimination. He hadn't finished speaking. Thorne suddenly felt as if a hook had yanked him from behind his navel. That force was simply impossible to resist. The next instant, his feet left the ground, and he was abruptly pulled up. He barely opened his eyes and saw Dumbledore opposite him, looking perfectly normal, clearly used to this situation. Then the world began to advance at breakneck speed. The wind howled, visibility was completely blurred, and nothing could be seen clearly. Thorne's hands were glued to the plunger, which seemed to have a magnetic force, pulling and dragging him forward. Until... thump! His feet landed heavily on the ground. If it weren't for an invisible force supporting his body, he had no doubt that he would have already landed face down. Thorne staggered a couple of steps, barely managing to steady himself. Oh! He rubbed his stomach, his voice weak. Is this how transportation works in the magical world? It felt like being thrown into a washing machine and rinsed all over. After saying that, he looked up at Dumbledore, who was still smiling, and said with a helpless tone. Okay, I'll get used to it. Then, he instinctively turned around. The scene before him calmed him down. A vast lake stretches out quietly at your feet. And atop the cliffs at the far end of the lake, a magnificent castle stands. Temporarily placed door keys are usually located in rather random places. Dumbledore smiled and said, Welcome, Professor Thorne. This is where you will be working from now on. With that, he led Thorne toward the castle. Along the way, the old bee introduced him to all sorts of information about Hogwarts, from the history of the castle to the structure of the house and the faculty, leaving no detail unmentioned. Thorne didn't hear a single word. His attention was completely drawn to the magnificent, almost unreal castle before him. Until the two arrived at the castle's massive main gate. Dumbledore suddenly showed a look of surprise. Oh, Severus, what brings you here? I thought you usually wouldn't be at school during the summer holidays. I was even planning to visit you in London. The man standing in front of the door remained silent for a moment before speaking coldly. I just came back to pick up some medicinal herbs. As for visits, that's fine if you are willing to pay overtime. Merlin's smallest socks. Dumbledore chuckled. Severus, how can I let my ears hear such a sinful word as overtime pay? The man did not reply. Just standing there, he gave off a damp, oppressive feeling. His voice was deep and cold, as if he had lived in the shadows for years. As Thorne listened to their casual conversation, he formed an impression of the man in his mind. Not to be trifled. After exchanging a few words, Dumbledore turned to the side, exposing the man completely to Thorne's view. The next moment, Thorne was completely stunned. Furry. Thorne, who had spent the entire day in the insect world, was confronted with an extremely strong visual impact. This is Severus Snape. Dumbledore introduced her naturally, the potions professor at Hogwarts, and also the head of Slytherin House. And this one? He then pointed to Thorne, it's Eric Thorne. At the moment, Dumbledore paused, seemingly unsure himself, the position is still pending. Snape stared coldly at the young man who was staring at him in a daze, his brows slowly furrowing. How? Is our new colleague mentally challenged? The words had barely left his mouth. Thorne immediately came to his senses. He stepped forward abruptly, grasped Snape's hand with unusual enthusiasm, and spoke with genuine emotion. Hello, Professor Snape. Absolutely right, Slytherin is right. What? What I mean is, we mammals are simply more advanced than arthropods. Thorne said so. But what stood before him was a giant bat. Chapter 4. Oh, so Hogwarts professors don't sort houses? Thorne asked with a hint of regret as he followed Dumbledore and Snape into the castle. The castle corridors are deep and ancient, with moving portraits hanging on both sides of the walls, and occasionally armor pieces move on their own, making a slight metallic clanging sound. In Thorne's eyes, however, the figures in these portraits were almost all insects. With vivid expressions and varied postures, they all look like a wall of insect specimens actively communicating. On the contrary, the armor, which could barely maintain a human shape, gave him some comfort. A bat and a bee walked ahead of him, whispering something to each other. Thorne didn't care what they were talking about. In contrast, he was much more interested in Hogwarts Castle itself. Current special environment, Hogwarts Castle, 1.9%. The moment the system notification popped up, he instinctively looked up and glanced around. Even though we've already passed through the reception hall and auditorium and officially entered the tower, we've only explored 1.9%? Thorne couldn't help but click his tongue in amazement. This castle is far too big. A staircase appeared ahead. He glanced subconsciously at the two insects walking ahead, a hint of doubt flashing through his mind. Since it can fly, why not just fly up there? However, he immediately dismissed the thought as soon as it crossed his mind. Oh, right. I'm mentally ill. Everyone else is a normal person. I'm so sorry. Snape suddenly turned around with a look of disgust, glanced at Thorne, and then lowered his voice to say to Dumbledore. Are you sure he's really up to the job of professor? He seemed to have even less knowledge of magic than the little troll who just enrolled. Oh, no, even less than the freshman. Dumbledore simply smiled, and the two stepped onto the spiral staircase. Severus, don't worry. The world possesses a vast and diverse array of magic, and Mr. Thorne embodies a type of magic we have never seen before. He spoke in a relaxed tone. Besides, I wasn't completely unprepared. There will be one more interview after that, which will be conducted by Minerva. You can also sit in on the class then. Snape paused for a moment. All right. I also don't want my future colleague to be a complete and utter incompetent person. Don't say that. Dumbledore chuckled and added, I think Thorne quite likes you. He paused, his tone becoming somewhat teasing. Mr. Mammal. Snape had just glared at him. Suddenly, a dull thud came from behind. The two turned around at the same time and saw Thorne hanging on the wall in an extremely strange posture, his hands gripping the wall, his body almost perpendicular to the wall. Then he suddenly pushed off the wall to propel himself upwards. Once, twice, 3 times. With swift and decisive movements, almost without any unnecessary pauses, he had already flipped and leaped onto the second-floor corridor. This scene completely stunned both Dumbledore and Snape. "Damn it!" Thorne muttered under his breath, "They even took away my mantis claws. Climbing walls is all about physical strength now, really." He took a breath and silently made a mental note. "We'll have to figure out how to make another one later." The thought had barely formed in his mind when he looked up and found the bee and the bat staring intently at him. Snape's furry ears were standing up high, even appearing somewhat shiny in the dim light of the castle. Thorne shrugged, pretending nothing was wrong. This staircase of yours is a bit unreliable." Dumbledore smiled, his tone gentle. "Yes, indeed, this is a magic school after all." However, Snape was clearly not listening to their conversation. His gaze was fixed on the hand that Thorne had used to climb the wall. A faint white light flashed across the palm, and the tiny scratches on the skin healed on their own at a speed visible to the naked eye. "This," Snape muttered to himself, "wandless spell casting? Or something else?" He looked up at Thorne, his gaze becoming truly serious for the first time. Then, he turned his head and said to Dumbledore, who was standing beside him, "I'll go put the materials away first. It'll be over in a little while." Before he finished speaking, he had already turned and left, his black figure quickly disappearing around the corner of the corridor. Thorne gazed at the retreating figure of the giant bat, his tone tinged with genuine regret. "Sigh, the whole castle feels a bit darker now that Professor Snape is gone. His head seems to reflect light." As soon as he finished speaking, he noticed the compound eyes of the old bee beside him subtly squeezing out a smiling expression. What's wrong?" "Nothing," Dumbledore said lightly, "just a heads up, it's best not to say things like that in front of Severus." He paused, then added, "And you'll see him again soon. We have one more interview." "Interview?" Thorne's expression changed instantly. But I don't even have a resume." Dumbledore slowly pulled a parchment from his red robe, his smile still kind. "It doesn't matter. We can make it up on the spot. Name, Eric Thorne. Gender, male, crossed out. I've been spending too much time in the insect world lately. Age, 22 years old. Education, Department of Genetics, Evolution and Environment, University of London, Medical Entomology. Okay, so it's a good match for my major. History of mental illness, in short, there is a cognitive impairment that leads to referring to people as insects. Research area, Soul Magic. Work experience, intern researcher at the Soul Sanctuary." Thorne hesitated noticeably when writing the last item. There's really nothing to fill in for this section. If Dumbledore hadn't insisted, and if he hadn't thought about his own experience in Hollownest, he wouldn't have written this down at all. "I've finally finished filling out my resume." Thorne handed over the parchment, breathed a sigh of relief, and then looked up to begin sizing up the interviewers opposite him. In the very center, of course, is the old bee Dumbledore, needless to say. Sitting next to him was a very serious-looking woman, dressed in a dark green robe and wearing thin-rimmed glasses. She was currently reading Thorne's resume word by word with her head down, without even raising an eyebrow. Next to him was Snape, the bat. He would occasionally look up and scrutinize Thorne with a critical gaze, completely devoid of the undisguised contempt he had initially displayed. As for the reason, Thorne couldn't quite explain it either. On the other side was a giant earthworm. She exuded a faint earthy scent, and her voice was gentle, giving off a very approachable vibe. However, what truly lifted Thorne's spirits was the last one. Human beings. That's right, this is the first time a truly human being has appeared here. He was a kind-looking man, though he seemed to be less than Thorne's knees tall, but that was enough to bring tears to Thorne's eyes. When I first met them, if it weren't for the fact that this was an interview, they would have been one of the interviewers. Thorne almost pounced on her and gave her a kiss. At this moment, Thorne was staring at the human with a wide smile. It's almost as if they made no attempt to hide it. Thorne was completely defenseless against the first human to appear in his field of vision. Buzz buzz buzz, Mr. Thorne. Buzz. 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 Mr. Thorne. Hey. I'm so sorry. Thorne snapped back to reality and subconsciously wiped his mouth. Great, it really makes my mouth water. He immediately sat up straight and looked at the mosquito lady who had called him earlier. The other person pushed up their glasses, revealing a pair of small eyes behind the lenses staring at him with obvious displeasure. I see on your resume that it says, Ms. Mosquito said calmly and professionally. You conducted research in this so-called Sanctuary of Souls. So, I'd like to ask, what was your research topic at that time? Chapter 5. Thorne thought for a moment, then decided to answer truthfully, actually, our research methods are rather simple and crude. Everyone leaned forward slightly. It involves extracting the souls of certain organisms, mainly snails, and then injecting them into our own bodies to observe the effects. I did indeed learn some of the soul magic I possessed during this process. The words had barely left his mouth. There was a moment of silence in the conference room. The professor's gazes almost simultaneously fell upon Dumbledore. To be honest, this description really sounds like black magic. However, Dumbledore remained calm and simply pointed to a certain section on the resume. History of mental illness. Everyone was taken aback for a moment, then suddenly realized what was going on. Oh. I see. The interviewers nodded in unison, and the atmosphere instantly became more reasonable. Lady Mosquito cleared her throat and continued, All right, now, please demonstrate your soul magic. Thorne hesitated for a moment. Then I'll demonstrate the most basic application. He thought for a moment, then added, Could I have a knife? A small knife will do. The air fell silent once more. A few seconds later, Snape, expressionless, reached into his robes and pulled out a BG knife, placing it with a clang in front of Thorne. Professors. The silence continued. Snape's face darkened, and he added in a cold tone. What? Is it unreasonable for a potions professor to carry a knife around? That makes sense. Thorne suppressed the urge to complain and reached for the BG knife on the table. The next second, without hesitation, he slashed his wrist. Blood splattered on the spot. Etc. Several professors specializing in insects stood up almost simultaneously, instinctively ready to rush forward to provide first aid, but their movements froze as soon as they began. Their eyes were all fixed on the hand that Thorne was holding the knife. There, a white substance, resembling both gas and liquid, was slowly emerging. This form was all too familiar to them. The ghosts that float everywhere in Hogwarts are a perfect example of this. How is this possible? Snape frowned deeply. That's a soul. Thorne nodded slightly. Then, he reached out his other hand and gently guided the wisp of white substance toward the wound. The moment the white substance came into contact with the wound, it seemed to possess a self-awareness and quickly covered it. To bond, to repair. Less than 3 seconds. The bloodstains disappeared, the wound was as smooth as before, and not even a scar was left. This. The enormous earthworm woman's voice trembled slightly. Is it healing magic? Or, wandless spell casting? It's not medical magic. Snape leaned back in his chair, his voice low but unable to suppress his emotions. It's something else. He took a deep breath. The very ability to extract the soul from the body and use it to heal the flesh is already quite incredible magic. His gaze returned to Thorne, and he could hardly hide his shock. That's the soul. In the current magical world, this is a field where even the entrance to research has not been fully opened, and wizards are finding it extremely difficult to make progress on this path. But the person before me is already able to extract his own soul and use it as a tool. This is no longer a matter of talent. This is revolutionary. Albus, Ms. Mosquito adjusted her glasses, her voice clearly tinged with surprise. Where did you find such a talented person? Upon hearing this, Dumbledore merely smiled slightly, his tone light and self-satisfied. Minerva, my eyes can spot the booger-smelling bean from a whole bunch of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. That's what you call keen insight. Thorne. So, is this person saying they smell like booger? He decided not to delve too deeply into the metaphor. Thorne cleared his throat, bringing his attention back to the main point. I wanted to confirm, what was the result of this interview? Ms. Mosquito ignored Dumbledore's smugness, stood up, and spoke formally. Buzz buzz buzz, Mr. Thorne. I think there's no need for a vote anymore. She nodded slightly. Welcome to the Hogwarts teaching staff. From now on, the young wizards will have one more new course. Dumbledore pulled out a professorship contract from somewhere, his movements so practiced it seemed he had prepared it all along. Thorne took the contract and immediately looked down to check the terms and conditions. Weekly wage, 150 gallons. He subconsciously looked up at the professors present, wanting to ask them a question. Is this treatment really fair? However, he suppressed the thought as soon as it popped into his head. Are you kidding me? The other person is Albus Dumbledore, hailed as the greatest white wizard of our time. Even if they did something, they wouldn't cheat him out of his meager salary, would they? Thorne quickly signed his name at the end of the contract. He let out a long sigh of relief the moment the pen touched the ground. Does this mean I've been given a permanent position? However, when he looked up and saw Dumbledore's smiling face, he inexplicably had a feeling that he had been tricked. After the contract was finalized, the bespectacled woman with the mosquito-like appearance stepped forward and shook hands with Thorne. Let's get to know each other formally. Minerva McGonagall, Vice Headmistress of Hogwarts, and Professor of Transfiguration. Then, she gestured to the enormous earthworm-like woman next to her. Pomona Sprout, Headmistress of Hufflepuff House, and Professor of Herbalism. Finally, there was the short, kind-faced human wizard. Phileas Frivy, Headmaster of Ravenclaw School, and Professor of Charms. Thorne was in high spirits and shook hands with the two men in turn. Especially when shaking hands with Flitwick, he got so excited that he almost forgot to let go, holding on and on until the other man coughed softly, at which point he came to his senses. All right, Professor Thorne. Professor McGonagall patted his arm. Let me show you around Hogwarts, after all, it's where you'll be spending a long time. As she spoke, she grabbed Thorne, preparing to drag him directly out of the classroom. Just then, Snape, who had been silent all along, suddenly spoke up. I also have some knowledge of soul magic. After that, we can discuss it a little more. Thorne immediately gave him an okay sign, smiling very sincerely. Of course, we mammals should help each other. Before he could finish speaking, Professor McGonagall forcibly took him away. In the classroom, Sprout and Flitwick, who was rubbing his hands, both turned to look at Snape. What does mammal refer to? Snape snorted coldly, his face expressionless, showing no intention of explaining. He straightened the hem of his robe, then turned and left the classroom. Few they even have private offices. The benefits here are really good. After being led around Hogwarts by Professor McGonagall, Thorne finally sat down in the common room that had been arranged for him, and he was visibly much more relaxed. He leaned back in his chair, cupped the back of his head in his hands, and let out a long breath. A familiar system notification appeared before my eyes. Current special environment, Hogwarts Castle, 15%. Today's harvest was quite substantial. Thorne sighed softly. But this castle is huge. I only got 15% after walking around it. But then again, there's still half a summer vacation left, plenty of time for me to explore this place thoroughly. Thinking of this, his mood lightened. And the professors here are all very nice people. As soon as he finished speaking, his brows furrowed slightly. A previously overlooked question suddenly surfaced in my mind. But then again, why does it seem to me that only Professor Flitwick is human? Chapter 6. 2 days later. So, you're saying that in your eyes, only Professor Flitwick, or people like Hagrid, aren't depicted as insects. In the Hogwarts medical wing, Thorne sat on the hospital bed, supporting his swollen face, looking at the fly lady in the white coat in front of him. As the other person spoke, they opened the door of the medicine cabinet next to them. Thorne nodded slightly. Yes, that's correct. He added something indistinctly. I was just so happy, Mrs. Pomfrey, that I momentarily let my guard down, and got attacked by his ridiculously hard biscuit. Ouch. This is the truth. In this despairing insect world, encountering two beings that looked like humans was something Thorne could truly celebrate. Even if one has to jump to barely reach the other's knee, the other can only reach the other's elbow when standing upright. Strictly speaking, none of them quite meet the standards of a normal human being. But that's still enough to make us feel relieved. However, on his third day in this world, he had already been hospitalized for the third time. It can only be said that he and this place are truly destined to be together. Mrs. Pomfrey let out a thoughtful murmur. Interesting. Based on your previous description and the diagnosis given by the Muggle doctor, I believe that your symptoms are very likely not simply a mental illness. As she spoke, she skillfully took out a bottle from the row of bottles labeled teeth-strengthening potion in the cabinet and handed it to Thorne. Here, hold it in your mouth, don't swallow it. Thorne did as instructed immediately. The moment the liquid touches your mouth, it feels like holding a piece of cool jelly in your mouth, a wonderfully tactile experience, even a little bouncy, making you want to take a bite. As Mrs. Pomfrey continued her analysis, the wings behind her unconsciously vibrated, making an annoying sound. I'm more inclined to believe that this is a manifestation of your magical outburst. One piece of evidence is your perception of insect morphology, which clearly exhibits some degree of selectivity. She closed the cabinet door and looked at Thorne. For example, you might see Dumbledore as a bee, or Professor Sprout as an earthworm. These are all fairly clearly defined characteristics. But you didn't treat Professor Flitwick and Hagrid like insects. These two have one thing in common, they both have unique mixed-race heritage. Professor Flitwick possesses fairy blood. As for Hagrid, she paused. Although he rarely mentioned it, most people could tell that he was most likely a half-giant. Ms. Fly tightened her white coat. It's probably not a coincidence that you were able to distinguish them. It's very likely that your magic, unconsciously, has produced some kind of special reaction to non-purely human beings. After hearing what she said, Thorne also felt that it made a lot of sense. For example, the wizards and healers he encountered after arriving in this world all seemed to be flies. Just as some unpleasant thoughts began to surface in his mind, Thorne suddenly realized that the jelly-like sensation in his mouth had quickly disappeared. He raised an eyebrow, subconsciously opened his mouth, and licked it with the tip of his tongue. The teeth that had been broken off had miraculously grown back perfectly without leaving any pain. Oh, how did you do that? Mrs. Pomfrey's wings fluttered slightly, and the somewhat irritating buzzing sound filled the air once again. Those densely packed compound eyes curved slightly, making a smile-like expression. This is the result of Professor Snape's personal improvement of the potion. Her tone was tinged with obvious pride. In the field of dental care, Hogwarts is undoubtedly a leader in the entire wizarding world. Oh! Thorne was somewhat surprised. I really didn't expect. Do students and teachers at Hogwarts often encounter dental problems? As he said this, images of earthworms and mosquitoes involuntarily came to mind. They don't look like creatures that would have dental problems at all. Could it be because of Snape? Although bats do indeed have teeth. Actually, not many. Lady Pomfrey shook her head. It's just that the absolute consumption of the tooth-strengthening potion is indeed very high. As she spoke, she gently closed the cabinet filled with the tooth-strengthening potion. All right, you don't need to worry about your teeth anymore. If you have any other problems in the future, feel free to come see me anytime. She paused, a glint of interest flashing in her compound eyes. Speaking of which, I'm quite interested in your mental illness, perhaps I could do some research in that area. Research? Thorne raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Could it be, there's a way to cure it? If he could truly overcome his habit of viewing people as insects, he would be willing to cooperate with the research, let alone kowtow to Madame Pomfrey on the spot. However, Mrs. Pomfrey shook her head. Uncertain. She spoke cautiously, however, I saw a case on the St. Mungo's Healing Magic Forum about treating Muggle schizophrenia through dream intervention. Perhaps we could try it, Professor Thorne. She paused mid-sentence, then instinctively turned around. Thorne, who had been standing in the same spot, had vanished without a trace. The door to the school clinic was ajar. Phew, almost. Thorne stood outside the medical wing with lingering fear, and couldn't help but let out a long breath. Oh my god, it's a dream. That thing is an absolutely forbidden slide in Hollownest. Although he had not previously dreamt of any signs of light, the consequences of bringing something like a plague into the world were unimaginable. The devastation of Hollownest was still vivid in his mind, and he had no intention of seeing Hogwarts suffer the same fate. Just then, a concerned voice suddenly sounded behind me. Thorne, are you all right? Thorne turned his head and saw a burly man standing not far away. The man's face was almost completely obscured by his disheveled long hair and tangled thick beard, but even so, a pair of eyes, like those of a black beetle, could still be seen shining brightly through the gaps in his hair. This is the man who almost defeated him single-handedly with his cooking skills. Hagrid, the gamekeeper at Hogwarts. The giant stepped forward with a guilty expression, his voice muffled, I'm so sorry, Thorne. I really didn't expect that rock bread could hurt someone. Thorne waved his hand, and couldn't help but laugh at the expression on the giant's face. It's all right, it was my own fault. Mrs. Pomfrey is quite professional, you can't tell at all now. Phew. Is that so? That's great. I won't make rock crust pancakes anymore. Hagrid visibly relaxed, but then looked puzzled. But when I hosted other professors before, they all seemed to like it. Thorne's lips twitched involuntarily. Maybe they're all just being stubborn. Yeah. Just then, a slight buzzing sound broke in. I actually think Hagrid's cooking is acceptable if it's combined with a softening spell. Thorne turned around and immediately perked up. Good morning, Professor McGonagall. A woman dressed in a dark green robe, nicknamed Mosquito Lady, was walking towards them with a book in her hand, her posture as upright and serious as ever. Good morning. She nodded in response to Thorne, then looked at Hagrid. Excuse me, Hagrid, I need to speak with Professor Thorne first about his course syllabus. Oh, of course. Hagrid nodded immediately, said goodbye to Thorne, and turned to leave. Thorne raised his eyebrows, his tone tinged with a hint of probing. Oh, Professor McGonagall, so you agree to let me teach young wizards how to extract the souls of living beings in class? That's one of the most important achievements in the field of soul magic. Please rest assured, Professor Thorne. Professor McGonagall spoke calmly but firmly. Even if the principal really stops eating sweets one day, I still won't agree to include that in the curriculum. Thorne's expression immediately fell. But on the bright side, at least now he finally understands who those teeth-strengthening potions were really for. Chapter 7. 5 minutes later, in the office of the headmaster of Gryffindor. Professor McGonagall looked down at the lesson plan Thorne had submitted, her eyes scanning back and forth between the pages. It was a complete teaching plan from 1st grade to 7th grade, with a clear structure, rigorous logic, and even the course objectives and the focus of each stage were clearly marked. You. She looked up, her tone clearly surprised. Have you worked in education before? No. Thorne answered honestly. Back when I was at the sanctuary, I often went to a local teacher's archive when researching certain topics. Over time, I learned a bit from it as well. As he spoke, his gaze unconsciously fell on Professor McGonagall's face. The mosquito lady's mouth parts were noticeably longer than before. Based on Thorne's past experience, this usually means satisfaction. He had previously exchanged drafting tips with a mosquito illustrator, and the other person would exhibit the same changes once he got engrossed in listening. Not bad, not bad. Professor McGonagall nodded, closing the lesson plan. It seems I don't need to provide you with any further training on teaching methods. However, she changed the subject. I believe the existing practical components can be completely removed, retaining only the conceptual explanations.